Good evening, and again, thanks to the National Academy of Science for putting this together. It's like a dream come true to actually have people with these interests in a room together from all these different disciplines. And my little 2-minute, 30-second anecdote, because we have a limited amount of time, is but when I stepped down as dean, one of the faculty members said, "Well, what are you going to do now?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go on Broadway." And well, I didn't make it to Broadway because I'm not really that talented, but I've just subsumed it in some other way. So, as it said, is that I've been teaching in law and bioethics in emerging medical technologies now for almost my whole career. And what that it often entails is bringing together people from different disciplines who talk different languages. And you have to figure out how to create an interdisciplinary discourse where they're listening to each other rather than talking at each other. And this becomes really a challenge when you're dealing with things that are very complex ethically and societally. And so I came up with this idea in part because it enabled me not to go to Broadway, but to be able to use theater in some ways, of could we use a creative approach of using theater to try to dig down deep on some of those complex ethical and legal issues. So this is part of a much larger project that Lynn Bush and I have been working on for a number of years. We write plays, but I'm not going to do any of those today, but we also examine existing theater. And I'm going to give a few examples of sort of taking you through historically and societally some of the major challenges in bioethics that have been driven in part by emerging medical technologies that have been driven by science as it moves forward. So I'm going to start in the 1970s and sort of follow along the evolution in bioethics. So our first play was written at a time in the 1970s when legal and ethical foundations of the right to die were beginning to evolve for both those patients who had capacity, they could make decisions on their own, and those who needed to make them on their behalf. And Brian Clark's Whose Life Is It Anyway had a role, in fact, in heightening public awareness of who decides how and when a patient may die, especially given the realities of the power dichotomy in medicine. Just a quick hands, looking at the demographics here. How many of you remember this play, which then was a movie? Whose Life Is It Anyway? Okay. And of course, remembering the discussion and the dialogue that was going on around the same time. So our protagonist, Ken Harrison, is a young sculptor. The hands, permanently paralyzed from the neck down as a result of an auto accident. And although he arrives at the hospital in critical condition, mainly because of medical technology, Dr. Emerson and his colleagues are able to keep him alive. But he's in a state where he no longer wants to live and unable to himself allow himself to die. He needs help. He's at the mercy of others. Now, the playwright sets the stage for the final scene in which the judge is to hear from the doctors, the lawyers, and Ken himself. I thought this was a nice scene to share since I am, in fact, a law professor. And in this dialogue takes a number of issues that we continue. We're debating them still today. Not only death with dignity, but the implications of our actions on others in society. So the judge starts. You tell me why it is a reasonable choice that you decided to die. Ken, it's a question of dignity. Look at me here. I can do nothing, not even the basic primitive functions. I can't even urinate. I have a permanent catheter attached to me. Every few days, my bowels are washing out. Every few hours, 2 nurses have to turn me over, and I would rot away from bed sores. Only my brain functions unimpaired, but even that is futile because I can't act on any conclusions it comes to. Will you please listen? Judge, I'm listening. Ken, I chose to acknowledge the fact that I am in fact dead, and I find the hospital's persistent effort to maintain this shadow of life an indignity and it's inhumane. The judge, but wouldn't you agree that many people with appalling physical handicaps have overcome them and lived essentially creative, dignified lives? Ken, yes, I would, but the dignity starts with their choice. If I choose to live, I would be appalling. It would be appalling if society killed me. If I choose to die, it's equally appalling if society keeps me alive. So the judge rules, as many of you know, that Ken is in complete control of his mental faculties and makes an order to set him free. Now, as the decades have passed since the 1970s, when this play was first produced, we've continued to establish and evolved into legal and ethical foundations of a right to die, from the baby Doe to Terry Schiavo, living wills, durable powers of attorneys, ethics committees, many, many court cases, expanding rights, and even tackling assisted suicide. Yet the debate continues. So moving into the 1980s, the Larry Kramer's 1985 play, The Normal Heart, provides a memorable platform to explore how both the medical community and the public responded when confronted with a novel and poorly understood infectious disease that was raging out of control, AIDS. Kramer found it very difficult to get this play produced at the time. Joe Papp agreed to stage it off-Broadway at the Public Theater. And based on Kramer's personal and professional experiences working as a gay activist, he depicts himself in the character of Ned Weeks. Many of you might have seen this on TV over the last few months. Really, really a great production. The goal is to capture the frustration of medical uncertainty and ethical dilemmas, in part through this character and the character of Dr. Emma Brockner, who was inspired by the life of Dr. Linda Laberstein, one of the first physicians to treat gay men in New York City during the early days of the epidemic. Now, Kramer explores how attitudes on the morality of homosexuality can blind society to the urgency of addressing a stigmatizing major public health threat. Ned declares, "We're all going to go crazy living this epidemic every minute while the rest of the world goes on out there, all around us, as if nothing is happening, going on with their own lives and not knowing what it's like, what we're going through." With great frustration, Emma acknowledges the discrimination and unethical practices she is witnessing while she works hard to piece together treatments of several chemotherapies with no real success. Her patients are all guinea pigs with no approved research protocols, no clear courses to follow. Another theme we face when trying to respond to new public health issues, especially among marginalized populations. So Emma says in frustration, "We won't get particularly good care anywhere, maybe not even here. I'll call it Hospital A. You come under a group of mad scientists, research fanatics, who will try almost anything, and if you die, you die. You just be a statistic in their computer, which they won't share with anyone else, by the way. That's not much sharing going on, never is. You'll be a true guinea pig." At Hospital B, they've decided they really don't want to get involved. It's just too messy. And Hospital C is like the New York Times and our friends everywhere, square, righteous, superior, and embarrassed by their disease and the entire epidemic. Yet 20 years later, The Normal Heart was revived on Broadway to rave reviews within a very different societal context. New perspectives and changing views on both the disease and on the gay population. Still no cure, but the virus was discovered, treatments were developed, anti-discrimination laws were passed, and new prevention strategies were implemented, at least in this country. So by the 1990s, the development of a new genetics, together with concerns about bioethics, had set the stage for the initiation of the Human Genome Project, and a major societal challenge. How do we allow the promise of science to move forward and at the same time keep in check the perils of what we learn? So these debates that surround these implications actually mimic many of the same during the eugenics movement at the beginning of the 20th century. The essential vision of a better society through regulating reproduction has endured. The new genetics holds the implicit promise of ending human disease. Yet it also raises familial questions about the societal perceptions of normalcy and the potential for discrimination. So, staged on Broadway in 1993, also made as a movie, The Twilight of the Golds by Jonathan Tollins examines the potential exercise of prejudice surrounding genetics. Tollins was prompted to hypothesize about the effects of genetic testing after reading two separate studies on the genetics of homosexuality, studies that have since been discredited as bad science. Now, the plot centers on the character of Suzanne, who finds out through fictional cutting-edge technology performed in her husband Rob's lab that her fetus is very likely to be gay. Early in the play, Tollins sets up the tension between David, Suzanne's gay brother, and her husband, Rob. Dave, face it, Rob, this is eugenics. It's blatant Nazi philosophy. Rob, oh, here we go again. Every time there's the slightest scientific advance, some knee-jerk liberal starts shouting about the Nazis. We're just trying to make life better. In an interview, Tollins said his play asked how, quote, how are we going to live together if we're suddenly given a godlike ability to reshape humanity? What criteria are we going to use if we want those we consider undesirable to die, as illuminated in a dialogue between David and Susan? David, what if you found out the kid was going to be ugly, or smell bad, or have an annoying laugh, or need really thick glasses? Where do we stop? So now we have this technology. What are we going to do with it? Suzanne says, why are you doing this? Because I'm fighting for my life, David says. Now, Tollins imagined and warns of a future in which prenatal genetic screening is commonplace, which it is 20 years later. And gene-based discrimination is a very real threat. Now, even though federal and state laws have passed to protect against genetic discrimination, they don't address a lot of these wider issues. Societal concerns, including the reproductive implications of this information, the reconceptualization of normalcy, tolerance for difference, the right to an open future, and the list goes on. Now, we can only speculate that in 2015, Tollins may not have written a play about a gay gene, but rather it could be another trait or a condition that might raise its own ethical and similar challenges. And for another day, I can share with you probably 2 handfuls of recent plays dealing with some of these issues. So, in fact, examining the search for a normal life, a dignified life, a right to control one's destiny is a theme explored in many, many plays. So I'm going to share the last one. This play, Next to Normal, Brian Yorkie's Pulitzer Prize-winning 2009 musical, Next to Normal, depicts the desperate search for medical intervention to control severe psychiatric bipolar disorder. I know this person. The show revolves around Diana, her family, and her many doctors' struggles to find her an effective treatment regimen and the implications of these exhausting attempts to get her to function, at least next to normal. Through a series of powerful musical numbers and dialogue, she and her psychiatrists explore how the evolving list of different medical interventions, from psychopharmacology to hypnosis to electroconvulsive therapy or ECT, may control her fate and theirs, for better or for worse. So, experimenting with different drugs, it is clear there is no quick fix. In song, now I will spare you from my singing voice, although I'm very tempted. Diana and her psychiatrist describe it. I don't think Brian Yorkie would like it if I sang. Dr. Fine, the round blue ones with food, but not with the oblong white ones. The white ones with the round yellow ones, but not with the trapezoid green ones. Split the green ones into thirds with a tiny chisel, and Diana describes her reality. I've got less anxiety, but I have headaches, blurry vision, and I can't feel my toes. Dr. Fine says, so we'll try again, and eventually we'll get it right, trying to reassure her and himself, to which Diana observes, not a very exact science, is it? Unfortunately, it is not. And this reality poses an ethical dilemma, along with trying to sort out who gets to decide what is right and for whom. Unable to cope, Diana attempts suicide and is rushed to the hospital. And her doctor, Dr. Madden, recommends ECT. Now, in an interview, Brian Yorkie shared that it was an article about mental illness and the administration of ECT over a decade and a half ago that sparked his interest in writing the musical. Now, as many of you know, ECT has had a long and controversial past, and the pendulum swings back and forth in response to early abuses, but more recently, guidelines and rules for administering it, often as a last resort, but implemented successfully, along with extensive informed consent. Now, as the playwright reminds us of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in the 1960s, Diana sings, didn't I see this movie with McMurphy and the nurse? That hospital was heavy, but this cuckoo's nest is worse. Yet in the end, she is well enough to express her feelings to her daughter, Natalie, who has been struggling with the impact of her mother's mental illness all her life. Diana says to her, we wanted to give you a normal life, but I realize I have no clue what that is. So we are left here looking at these four plays with a fundamental ethical question brought to life in this play and in all of these plays that we've discussed. What's normal and who decides? So characters in theater dramatize both the promises and perils of science and medical interventions, and yet the uncertainties of our futures. But be it in the context of a dignified death, a public health epidemic, new genetic technologies, or treatments for mental illness. Thank you.